We recovered because one of us gave up the yielding turn and yielded the turn. And, who that is and what we end up talking about and how it gets back on track. There are various different tactics, but what we just did, that's conversation repair.
Welcome to the Conversation Factory. I'm your host, Daniel Stillman. Each episode, I'll talk to an amazing conversation designer to try and distill insights we can all bring into our work and lives. Human conversation is a material that can be shaped by design, and shifting conversations in everyday meetings, in organizations, and yourself can create real change. And I hope to help you do it better and more authentically. I'd love to have you stay part of the conversation. Head over to theconversationfactory.com to sign up for my newsletter and never miss an episode. That's theconversationfactory.com. I'd also love for you to be part of the show. If there's a challenging transformation you're working through, head over to theconversationfactory.com, click coaching, and sign up for 30 minutes of free coaching that we might use on the show. Head over to theconversationfactory.com, hit coaching, and let me know what conversations you need help redesigning. Enjoy the episode. In this episode of The Conversation Factory, I had the distinct pleasure of talking with Nandini Stocker, the head of conversation design advocacy and partnerships at Google. She's the rare individual who is more of a conversation design geek than me, to the point that she interrupted me just to make a point about how awkward interruptions are. We cover a sprawling number of topics in conversation design, and you might enjoy downloading Google's PDF on how conversations work and read along. I think just knowing that threading, repair, and turn-taking are things means you can look for them in your own work and find ways to transform conversation experiences that you design, even ones that aren't in the digital world. David Bohm, the storied physicist, wrote a book called On Dialogue and said, conversation is a principled, mutual process of collaboration and negotiation. So I shouldn't be surprised when Google's map of how conversations work matches exactly to the process of opening, exploring, and closing I teach groups to follow when designing a creative, collaborative process for design thinking and innovation. Opening a channel for conversation is like the invitation into a cooperative game, a world to explore and engage with. And every leader needs to think empathically to design those invitations to be inviting. Finding places along a conversation journey where there is breakage leads us to think about how to repair the thread of conversation and keep things moving along towards closure, a desired action or agreement. We've been conversing for thousands of years, and we've gotten pretty good at it. But being good at something doesn't mean you know how to teach someone else. Nandini's work is specifically on how to help us talk to digital agents with more natural ease. We spoke a few weeks ahead of Google's I/O conference, and she's since sent me a wealth of talks that happened there that you might enjoy digging into. One of my favorites is about conversational hacks, where one of her colleagues digs into the cooperative principle, a way of helping us think about how relevant, clear, and helpful information is exchanged at a steady pace in a good conversation. Compare two exchanges. How much did your shirt cost? Don't you love it? I got it at Vinny's Vintage Warehouse. Versus, don't you love it? Shirt has 5 letters and 5 is my favorite number. To a computer, both responses contain about the same amount of information. But only a human conversationalist can tell that the information is irrelevant and unhelpful, at least for now. With that, I'll leave you to enjoy the episode. Thanks for listening. Nandini Stocker, thank you so much for making the time today. Welcome to the Conversation Factory.
Thank you.
You are the head of conversation design advocacy and partnership for the Google, as the rest of us call it, the Google.
That's right. The interwebs, the Google.
Interwebs, the Google, yes. All of the thes. Yeah, so I want to talk to you. You're one of the rare people who I think is maybe as much of a conversation design geek as I am. I'm hoping we can talk about the history of studying conversations. You know a lot more about this stuff than I do, from Grice's maxims to threading. But I also want to talk about the history of speech recognition, and hopefully we'll get some Star Trek worked into this as well.
We must get some Star Trek worked into this.
Yeah. So by the way, so the people who are not, because this is, artificial internet radio, like you actually do look like 7 of 9. Like,
yes, 7 of Nan is my handle. It's stuck a long time ago, was my Yahoo handle. AOL even back in the day. Yeah, it's kind of stuck. It was around the time that it was the show was on, and at the time I had my hair up and everything, and people at the office. I worked at LexisNexis at the time, and yeah, they just kept saying, we're just going to call you 7, and now here we are. And I like to drag that out as long as possible because I love it.
It's awesome. Just, without the little, whatever they call it, that last little bit of tech that's still on her face.
Right. The Borg implants, if you must know.
Yeah, that. So what I'm hoping you can just give me a little bit of like why conversation using the story of your life.
Why conversation? I've always, I talked really early. They say that girls talk early, they develop language earlier. I'm not a neurologist or actually not even, didn't even study linguistics formally. It was part of a communication degree I got. But I did start really early. My first language was German, and my parents traveled all over. And so I'm more of, sometimes when people are when you hear if you're a linguist, they ask you immediately, how many languages do you know? And I'm not a linguist, and linguists will tell you it's not about how many languages you know, but being an expert in the structure of language. I think that, so someone who knows a lot of languages or has an affinity for learning languages is a polyglot. I think I probably am. Over the course of my life, I've traveled all over. I've lived in the Philippines, Taiwan, Germany, all over Europe, and all over the United States. And I've learned a lot of languages and oddly forgotten them as well. So, for example, I learned Tagalog when I lived in the Philippines as a young girl, but don't remember but a few words. I learned Mandarin. I was in 4th grade in Taiwan, and I remember the phonetic alphabet, and I can recognize Taiwanese Mandarin dialect if it's being spoken, but don't understand it. And so I guess through living and being around so many cultures, different languages, even in my own house, I don't know how much of it's genetic, how much of it's nurtured, but I've just learned how to talk to people in various different contexts. And so much of conversation is a back and forth between two people, but with lots of other context clues always available and at your disposal. So when I talk to people, particularly, I find face-to-face and spoken language to be the most powerful. There's so much you read from the other person, their facial expressions, how they're taking it in. You know what I'm talking about,
sure.
Right? Because
yeah. Oh, we started this call with some video just for that because you build that different type of rapport.
Exactly. And so you can sort of read. You can have this sense of when you're talking to someone, what's sinking in, what's not, what's kind of, even as I'm doing it right now, I'm sort of mimicking my face, like what what I would be quizzically doing. And I guess I got, over the course of my life, if there was one skill that really got me through all those travels and, put it out there, I had a pretty untraditional childhood. That's how I got by, was learning to talk to people of all different ages. And even in my career, some people joke, you're the business whisperer, or you're the developer whisperer, or you know how to talk to engineers. But I feel like we have this common thread. Everyone does. We're all human, and I like to talk to anyone on the bus or airplanes. Anywhere I am, different cultures, and you can find some sort of common thread with anyone if you just stop, listen, and have that back and forth exchange, with or without the same language. And I've that's been something that's been kind of core of my own gut learning. I think that you don't have to know the names of the tools to be good at using them. So I think you can be a great conversationalist without necessarily knowing what threading is, or turn taking, turn yielding, back channeling, and all these linguistic terms that we use, you need to know them if you want to start to manufacture conversations, but you can learn to be a great conversationalist by being a good listener, first and foremost, and paying attention how information exchanges between two people.
But do you think you're using some of that structure to have better interchanges with people?
Absolutely. I mean, yes and no. I don't manipulate conversations, or I actually don't go into them super prepared all the time. I know that sounds strange. You should prepare and kind of rehearse in your head. Like if you have an important conversation you're about to have, something that's got an outcome you're kind of counting on, you sort of have to keep certain things in the buffer, and maybe you've planned out how you want it to go. And I'm talking about things like an interview, or you're trying to, connect to get everyone gets a little something out of each conversation, and they walk away from. And maybe it's just that they're a little less lonely than they were a few minutes ago.
Yes.
Just some sort of connection, or they've planted a seed that maybe will turn into an idea that the other person will have 5 years later. You just don't know.
Yeah.
So you might go into a conversation with a plan. There's a point you want to get across. You have a goal. Maybe you've thought through it and you've planned a little bit. But I think the key is actually in the moment, adjusting accordingly to context and paying attention to cues and how you might, what you want to get out of it, and listening. And that's how you can, one thing is that the other person's going to get out what they're going to get out. And if you have something to convey, if you're the holder of the information that you want to convey, you have to pay a lot more attention to what you want to get out of it. But
yes. There's a huge difference between a conversation where there is a high expectation of what you're going to transact or act out of the conversation versus a very low expectation of what's going to be transacted at the end of the conversation.
Exactly.
So I'm looking at... sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I'm looking at the... Are we going to repair?
What we just did was conversation repair.
Yeah.
And
you were doing that on purpose to me, weren't you?
I was grabbing, and then we had this kind of thing that we do when we are like in a bad cell phone connection and there's slight delay.
Yes.
But we recovered because one of us gave up the yielding turn and yielded the turn. And, who that is and what we end up talking about and how it gets back on track. There are various different tactics, but what we just did, that's conversation repair. But go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, well, actually, no, because I actually wanted to talk about those steps and for like opening the channel and so on. And repairing broken conversations and threading are two things I really do want to talk about, because it seems like sometimes with people and also with computers, repairing a broken conversation can be tiresome.
Absolutely. Really frustrating.
Yeah. So talk a little about this. It's like, oh, I didn't understand you. You're like, oh, fine, this.
Right. We humans have gotten pretty good at this because we can adjust accordingly live as we see what's unfolding in front of us and come up with whatever technique to get back on track and can sort of judge what's not working in the moment. Oh, it's because they didn't, they just don't hear me, or they're looking at me with this quizzical face that probably means they didn't even understand anything I said. Maybe they don't speak the language. Like you can sort of judge what the issue is at hand. The challenge for doing it for a computer interface of any kind is that so much of that has to be manufactured with all the conditions that need to occur ahead of time. And so how do you, ahead of time, count on all the contextual things that could be going wrong and handle them appropriately in that moment? That's what's so complex, is that you have to say, okay, if something goes wrong, if they don't, some of them you can easily break up and just say, okay, we can try to, even if you just broke it up by, we got some sort of input or we didn't, the timeout, or the user didn't say anything. even that alone is very hard to split up because, well, maybe they said nothing, but they also said maybe they said something and it just wasn't picked up by the speaker or the microphone. Or maybe they said something and the system that's doing the taking that input doesn't have what's called bargain, a capability where it's listening as it's talking. So maybe it was just talking and they started talking, and by the time they finished, that point at which it was their turn to talk has only just started. And so then there's you don't even know they started talking.
So you're
then
saying like a computer
say?
that doesn't know how to stop talking when I start talking. Like that's what the bargain capability is, or it doesn't know how to listen when it's talking.
Exactly. And I mean, that's a capability. It's an engineering problem on whether a system has that or not. There are systems out there that do, some that don't. But even the term bargain is kind of harsh. It's like that's a rude thing to do, to barge in anyway. And so
So interestingly, there's a podcaster that I listen to, James Altucher, and what he does is he tells his guests at the beginning, he says, "By the way, I'm sorry I interrupt a lot," and he just sort of puts it out there. It's a very interesting affordance. He says, "I may interrupt you. Please don't take that as an offense. It just means that I'm eager to ask another question." And I find that's a very interesting way of opening that channel of saying, this is what might happen later. It's a pre-repair.
The pre-repair.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, in conversational, pragmatics and structure, it's actually in real life, it's something called conversational overlap, where when sometimes you interrupt because you're just doing sort of a yes and structure. You're just agreeing and adding on, and we pile on to each other's ideas. And I can't cite the exact studies, but the perception that comes along with that is, if you were to ask those people later, were you interrupted? They will usually say no, like they can't recall being interrupted because that kind of overlap when you're just agreeing or bouncing the same idea, sometimes that interruption isn't, and that has to do with turn taking and turn yielding. So what you were just doing, making kind of nonverbal sounds to continue to basically yield the floor to me to continue talking.
He said verbally yielding the floor to you.
Indeed. Oh, that's my 7 of Nan coming out. Indeed. It's one of my favorite words in the English language. But anyway.
Indeed.
That sometimes that conversational overlap or someone piping in is just like parenthetical information, just adding to the discussion but it's still your turn to talk. I'm just showing you that what I'm receiving and how I'm processing it, and it's contributing to move the conversation forward.
And yet I think like Siri or Google Home saying seems sort of fascinating. I don't think any of them really do that just now. If I'm like putting in an address or an order, like, got that. Thanks, boss. Like there's not that kind of true conversational interface like Tony Stark's Friday or Jarvis, where they're like, there's a much more human response to ongoing information that's being offered to them.
Right. I think we're not there yet. I think we need to be eventually for people to have that comfort level. Part of the problem, I think, is because when you start getting to those really kind of human habits, I do hope that we get there, even a little bit more of it to just enhance the personality, because, if it's an effective assistant, for example, you want to see that they're processing what you're saying, but that they're also very capable and all that good stuff. But I think that, we're not, one of the problems is if you add in little elements like that, because you think, I'm going to add, and things like that, but then you're not adding in more basic conversational repair or even the capability for, margin or these other things that are fundamental to language structure. It breaks, it doesn't accomplish the goal. It just makes it it's like uncanny valley thing happening where...
Yes. It's like a design flourish that does nothing. There's no additional functionality. It's just like a swirl.
Exactly. Like there are far more powerful things you could do to get it closer to communicating effectively. But that isn't to say that you shouldn't add personality, because that's actually pretty key for it to move forward and to help people feel comfortable. But just adding those things doesn't solve some of the more fundamental things that these systems need to be able to do.
Yes. Let's talk a little bit about personality, because I was at a great talk at the Interaction Designers Association conference back in February, and somebody contrasted Alexa versus Siri. I think when you ask them, like, what's my husband's name, Siri says, oh, you haven't told me yet. And Alexa says, don't you think you should know that? And they're two such different answers. And Alexa's is funny.
Right.
It's handling. It's a really good error repair strategy. It's like, well, I don't know, and they didn't tell me, and I could just tell you that, or I could turn it into an opportunity to actually construct a deeper relationship with you.
Right. It's a little smarter. It looks at the context of the question to begin with. Wait, why are you asking this? I mean, at the core, first of all, every system has a persona, whether you have a name or you design for it or not. So putting some intention around that design is critical for any system, because the minute you, especially when there's voice involved, the minute you introduce voice to the equation, but chat even, which chat mimics conversation, is called chat for a reason. It's a little more single-threaded, or it's a little different, but people will infer personality. But voice in particular, people will attribute a personality. If you were to ask them what color hair and all that, some people get really into it and they'll describe what that persona is. But so coming up with some guidelines around who is this character and what are their main kind of core attributes that come across in the dialogue will give you those guardrails. So when questions like this come up, how would you handle that? And that will give you that, decision about between. I'm using my hands, which you can't see, like on this in this hand.
Well, because there's fewer dimensions in this conversation. Yeah,
I know we're using a 0D interface, but I'm describing now that no. So, but it will give you those guardrails between, okay, when a question like this comes up, is it a capable assistant that is just going to answer each question very literally, or is it going to take into consideration the perception and everything else that comes with how that particular question is answered? And it's a very, very complex challenge to solve. But when if you're prepared for it and you have that kind of core thing to fall back on of what you're designing for, it does make it a little easier. And then, you end up with answers like that, okay, well, that fits that kind of persona of what you would expect. And it does sort of paint the picture. I mean, it made an impression on you, right?
Yeah. Well, so there's so many things I want to follow up on. One is just this idea of the guidelines that you put around a conversation, because it seems to me like conversation is this fluid, rhythmic, human sort of thing. And then I sometimes think of a conversation design as just like a sort of a waveguide, like a tube where we say, these are the things that we're going to do to guide this conversation and keep it going in one preferred direction.
Right.
That we design what the conversation is and isn't going to be.
Right.
And that is what the conversation design, in that sense, would be. Hey, this is Daniel. We're about the halfway point, so this is a great time for you to get up, stretch your legs, get some popcorn, fill up your soda. If you're in the car, stay focused. If you have your hands free, this is also a great moment to head over to theconversationfactory.com to sign up for the newsletter. I send out more detailed write-ups, insights, and tools from these conversations, and I'd love to share them with you. So head over to theconversationfactory.com and stay in the loop.
I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about what's the purpose of the conversation? Is it an exchange of information? Again, all these concepts always overlap. So back to persona, who are on both ends? There's the user as well. So who are the two sides of the conversation? Or in real life, who are the two people? And what is the purpose of that? And what is the context? So is one the keeper of the information, the other one is the inquirer, and they need that information, vice versa? Or is it just a fun exchange? So the purpose of the system, if it's just a game, for example, if it's just a game and the purpose is one trying to guess a number the other person is thinking of or whatever, it's a very different construct to, say, trying to transact or do something. So, for example, if you're just doing, I don't know, a restaurant reservation, or if you have an idea of another one we could break down, but something where it's almost like if at first, when you first look at it, you think, oh, we'll just have it's almost like we're just checking off things on a form that we need. And so a restaurant reservation is what? 4 things: the place, how many people, the date, and the time. Those are like your basic 4 things you need to get across. Well, you could shoehorn it into this little pipe of just asking for the first thing, the second thing, the third thing, and the fourth thing.
Yes.
Or you could ask, and then you could like not even ask to begin with. The person walks up and says all 4 pieces of information all at once, or 3 of them, and only one is left, or 2 at a time, or whatever. All of that we could do so naturally and fluidly in real life, trying to manufacture that. So, I mean, in the context and how you would then ask each separate question varies by how you would lead into it.
Yes.
So, for example, I mean, if you said, I want to make a reservation at whatever restaurant for, a table for 2 at, restaurant A for 7.
Yes.
Chances are you never said the date. You asked for it just now and you said it like that. It's 2:00 in the afternoon. Chances are it's for tonight. So asking for the date, which was maybe that would have been the third thing you asked if you were doing it step by step. Suddenly you're just asking, is this for tonight?
So this goes back to the question of the fact that computers have for a long time known what we were saying, but not knowing what we meant.
That's right.
So you talked about this in one of your presentations that you sent me, the history of computers knowing what we're saying. The idea that the first speech recognition was a computer being able to recognize one person saying just numbers is an amazingly narrow a bit of computer intelligence. And now you can take everything that I'm saying and turn it into text using artificial intelligence, but the computer doesn't know what I said. And that disconnect is, I think, still shocking to people. Absolutely. It's actually a pretty critical juncture right now where the technology is, because for a long, long time, that was the challenge. And those of us designing, trying to design natural conversations had to sort of design alongside as it matured. And now we're getting to the point where what's actually said, transcribed from spoken language to text, is pretty darn good. As good as it, it's right. And it's based on data. It's based on trillions of utterances. And so once they solve for, I say they, I don't mean to be flippant. It's a community of deep scientists who've solved this problem. Thank you to them that we can now look at the next big problem. But it's worth stopping and appreciating that the difficulty of that problem. But it's deceptively simple. But it comes down to having broken down sound waves into the individual phoneme segments of language. And so once that has been, once we know how to do that based on all the different ways that those sound can be communicated, you could do that for any language if you have enough data. Yes.
But
and it's this brute force method that they do not know what's being said. They just it's shape and pattern recognition more than constructing a meaning.
Right.
So I want to. And so, oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna. So to more directly answer your question, now I want to geek out about that conversation repair, but I'm very parenthetical. So
no,
real life conversation.
It's always pretty meta to be having a conversation when talking about conversations.
I know, right? Yeah. But yeah. So now it's almost like we are even more frustrated because we know that problem solved, to realize like now we've got to deal with the fact that we have all this text and what do we do with it? It's even so. That's all. I can tell you that IBM, Google, Amazon, all of the teams of speech scientists out there, are around the world who are working on this know this, and they're working deeply on getting the context right and to be able to serve that up to people who are designing, like people like on my team who are designing for these conversations. That's to us is sort of the holy grail of being able to design a true conversation. And until we get there, we hope that it'll be a little bit of a push and pull where the types of things we've been wanting to design for a long time will help shape the direction that goes. But we have a few tricks to try to keep them natural anyway, to try to access as much of the context as we can in a moment. Things that we can do is that we try to take advantage of are things like tracking what has happened in the conversation and any information the user has provided to help shape that. Like I said, like my example about the restaurant one is a very simple.
That's threading, right? That where chatbots right now aren't very good at that. Of where the third answer is incorporating the first answer.
Right. Well, threading is something that takes advantage of how you get from one turn of a conversation to the next. So setting it up ahead of time and saying, so if you said something like, "And is this for tonight?" And there's something called discourse markers, and as you know, where you relay from one turn of the conversation to the next, all those little pieces of glue in the language that get each concept from one to the next smoothly, and threading from one question to the next includes a lot of little tools that you can connect together.
So now you're talking about conversations that happen in a time and place. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about longer conversations, because threading in this time and place makes it's clear what those discourse markers are and how I link one utterance to the next. I'm curious about longer conversations, like with family and friends, where we still do that relinking over these longer waves of discourse.
Oh, sure. I mean, shared social context and that schema building is something that's important as well. All of I mean, you could say that all your relationships of people they build over time, and maybe all your conversations with them are threaded, and you pick up where you left off. They say like a good friend, you could miss out on 10 years and you just pick up where you left off. That seems like maybe that's a macro, I don't know, I'm making this up right now. Yeah. Macro conversation of your life. I don't know with each relationship you have. But yeah, I mean, conversations are kind of interesting that way. I like that concept of it's one long conversation. Is that what you're thinking, Daniel?
It is. So, because I'm looking at so on the white paper that I downloaded, there are 6 steps, but in between your talk and the white paper, I think there's actually 8 steps. I'm just going to go through them because I want to touch on all of them a little bit, because we've danced around them. You talk about opening a channel, committing to engage, constructing meaning, evolving to converge and have an agreement that there is repair, and then we act or transact, and then we close.
Right.
And obviously, like the constructing meaning, evolving, repair. I think, like, if we were to draw this, like there would be like a cycle in there, and then there's like, I don't know if converging in agreement is acting and transacting, and then there's this sort of, that is the close, and I feel like,
it's actually very hard to break up a conversation into its distinct units when so many of these things happen across the different steps. So you're always constructing meaning, you're always evolving. You converge on agreement in your various turns you're taking, and you can repair at any time. So it's really more, it feels a little bit more like you open a channel. The most critical piece is for it to feel like a succinctly self-contained unit of a conversation is, opening a channel, committing to engage, two people join a conversation. Stuff happens. Maybe it's just a quick, hi, how are you? Bye, I gotta run. some sort of closing to that conversation is that, you've closed it, and maybe you didn't do a whole lot in between. That's still a valid conversation. So I think that, we try to break it up into its components, knowing that some conversations involve more than others. So, particularly these concepts like repair can happen at any time. But what you can usually, almost anyone can recognize is that when a conversation has a rough, like hasn't really gotten started. So if you walk up to someone and you say, hi, how are you? They look at you and then they just continue what they're doing, and they don't, that doesn't feel right. It feels weird, and it feels like we didn't actually start a conversation. And so that's pretty critical to just starting it. But then where it goes from there seems pretty fluid and hard. It's hard to compartmentalize conversations, I think.
Yes, and yet that is our jobs. So
indeed.
So what's interesting to me about these phases is that they apply very much to these other types of conversations that I design. I normally design multi-threaded group conversations that happen over a day or multiple days, or even over weeks or months. That the sort of, we open a channel about design, what we're going to design. We try to construct meaning about what's important for us to build or to not build. And then we try to converge on agreements and get back on track. And then hopefully we'll close out that process and leave with a commitment to do something. Like, that's when I look at a group conversation that I design, I look at these steps of the speech interface, and I feel like they very much apply to the kinds of group conversations that I design. Do you feel like you use these design principles to design other conversations in your life?
Oh, sure. When we started talking, we talked a little bit about this concept of that, conversation and great interactions, meaningful connections are a way of life. And I absolutely do that. I try to make every conversation count. And again, without manipulating them, I think about how to start a conversation, but it's very, very much in the moment and fluid. And I really adjust according to each person I'm talking to. Group conversations are interesting because in order for them to be effective, it's still only one or two people talking at once, right? It still needs to be this dynamic of people contributing, bouncing off of each other, taking a piece and continuing it. And it can introduce different power dynamics into a conversation. And so I pay really close attention to those types of things in meetings. I care about when someone hasn't said anything for a while, or if someone clearly is making turn-taking cues, like they want to get, these signals people give when they want to get in a word, they start kind of moving their body differently, or they try to, they start saying something, they open their mouth, even though
they'll take a
they
breath.
probably wouldn't. Yeah, take a breath. I pay attention to this also as a, trying to, I mean, let's face it, in the tech industry, sometimes they're only, and I guess we'll just go there. There are fewer women in the room, and like I'm fascinated by this concept that I've heard of the women in the Obama administration, for example, who made an actual concerted effort to, when one woman said something, it's just incredibly effective for another woman to acknowledge the idea from the first woman, continuing it on, backing her up and continuing. And this actually isn't even something that just applies to women, but this in a group conversation, in a meeting where everyone's trying to come to consensus of acknowledging someone else's idea, like an improv, adding to it brings everyone's ideas closer to the center and foremost, and there's a lot less that gets lost on the sidelines of people having to sort of jockey for getting their idea on the table. It's pretty powerful, I think, for people to do as much listening as they are talking and really acknowledging whose ideas are coming to the table, because there's less taking of each other's ideas that way, and everyone having a voice in the. So I think it's fascinating. I'm definitely interested in your perspective on group conversations and how to make those effective. But those are some of the techniques that I'm aware of in group conversations. And I guess one other one is just, I find, I'm pretty technical, but I'm also, a conversationalist, and can sort of sense when maybe two different groups, maybe engineering and design, or someone more of a business focus versus a technical focus, or what have you, in the same room. I'm usually one of the people who might notice the common thread between the two, but they maybe aren't realizing each other or saying the same thing. And I like to. I find it. I love being able to connect the ideas that way and see what happens. Like, and you can't be prescriptive about these things. Just say this, and that'll be the magic thing. Like, and this goes for machine conversations too. It's very hard to just say. You get artificial. You become transparent quickly when you say things like, "What I'm hearing you say is," and "What I'm hearing this other person say is."
Yeah.
It has to be a little bit more fluid than that. But do you get what I'm saying? That like
I do.
You hear, yeah.
It's interesting because this idea of committing to engage, the sort of second step of the conversation flow, and going back to something else you said, where you still need to, in designing a conversation, to apply all the normal things you would apply about design. Predominantly that it's human-centered. You actually want to understand the people involved. There is an awareness in that commitment to engage that the other person is a person too.
Exactly.
And I think that's where that conversation is a way of life, where you're like, well, I want to say this, but I also understand that other people might want to say things.
That's right.
And that is a really interesting awareness.
Right. There's this concept of self-awareness. You know what it's like, and no one is immune to this, of where you're in a conversation with someone and you're so busy thinking of the next thing you're going to say, and you're rehearsing it in your head, and you've got this, you're ready to jump in, and you're just letting them finish so that you can say the thing, especially in a group of 3 or more, that you end up with a missed opportunity of tuning into what the other person is saying that might shift and change how you might say that. I mean, you have a buffer going the whole time, right? You have all these things that could come up. You're making mental notes of, well, if I have a room to say this one thing, I want to definitely bring it up, but now's not a good time. And you have all these things going on in your head. But in the moment, when someone else is talking, having that self-awareness and courtesy, and that to really be listening more and being open more than rehearsing what will come out of your own mouth next is a skill I think everyone is kind of owes it to the other person in the conversation to pay attention to.
So I'm going to just add, looking at those phases of conversation, I feel like they're also applying to yourself internally, because
absolutely, yeah.
So there's this word manipulation, which has a double edge to it, because you are in fact looking at your own internal conversation and saying, "Not right now." You're actually pushing it. You're manipulating. You're saying this is not the right time, or you say, "Oh, I'm going to take this piece and I'm going to bring it to the surface." You converge on some agreement.
Right. Manipulation, like a lot of terms in the English language, have connotations on the surface level. Things like, other words like diversity and accessibility and, terms like that get thrown around a lot, and there's a lot deeper. And then manipulation is like yet another word where it sounds like it has a negative connotation, but it has meaning, and it's
to move with the hands. Yeah, it's like it's using your hands to make something move.
Yes. Yeah, you are, well, you're processing your whatever word you want to use. You're right. You're having sort of like an inner dialogue the whole time as well.
So there's so many things, so many more things I'd love to talk to you with about conversation design, but we are getting close to the end of time. So I want to just ask you some other questions. One is, what other conversations you design?
So besides designing for and helping others to design conversations between humans and machines, computers, bots, what have you, we touched on it a little bit. Like I try to make every conversation count. I specifically, in the style that I communicate, people sort of joke that there's such a thing as Nandini's network, that that I will just also do a few things over email, but I'm the first one to say, let's just take 15 minutes and talk in person. And I don't always design a structure or how that's going to go, but I'm very intentional about creating opportunities for conversation, if that makes sense.
It does.
So to me, I'm very intentional about a conversation needs to happen, and using the power of spoken language and communicating one-to-one or one-to-many, but that power of connecting and using spoken language for everything that it's evolved to be can accomplish a lot that might get lost or misconstrued in emails back and forth that are static. And so that's the same thing I find challenging about writing prompts for a system where all these things could happen in this one moment in time, and I want to make sure that this is only spoken on. Well, then this could happen, then that could happen. I find that same challenge when I'm writing emails, for example, because I try to think of all the ways someone might process this one static thing I'm writing. So it doesn't work very well for certain types of conversations I want to have. I want to have them in person. I want to talk through something, and then email works well as a wrap up, a follow up, because we've built that schema together. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does,
but okay.
It also goes to your view of conversation as a way of life. The conversation is a fluid thing, and if you there's a danger to over designing a conversation. Let's just say
absolutely.
That. I think
that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
At least in human conversations. I'm also curious about just where you go to educate yourself, to expand your thinking, and books that help you know more about what it is that you actually are doing, sort of related, and then the wider circle of just how do you feed your head.
That's really great. I mean, I can send you some books I recommend. Anything by Clifford Nass is fantastic. I think that, so personally, I read a lot. I listen to a lot of audiobooks, mostly fiction, believe it or not, because I love to absorb dialogue in an audio form. So I listen to talks, I watch talks, but I actually consume a lot of audio. But mostly I'm very intentional about the conversations around me. I work with some brilliant voice user interface designers, and they are constantly, it's like ear candy, the way they throw around linguist terms, and I love being around them. That's what I love more than anything. My job is being around other designers in this space, because they all bring something very different to the table. Some of them are, specialized in just in prosody or language structure or different languages.
Is that how it's pronounced, by the way? Prosody? I thought it was prosody.
Yes.
We didn't even talk about that. I hope, by the way, that this is not the last conversation we have. I would love to have you back on again.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I feel like we only literally have scratched the surface about,
right.
We could have a whole conversation just about how to repair broken conversations, which would be awesome.
Right.
Because we all have broken conversations that are in need of repairing, right?
We absolutely do. But I mean, so that and everything else, I just pay close attention. Like I pay close attention to the conversations around me, and I try to connect with each person that I'm talking to, and give it my attention in the moment, and give my eye contact and my ears, and that's where I learn the most, to be honest, is just from people every day. You learn a little something from every conversation, and that's where I get most of what keeps me growing and learning in this space.
That's beautiful. You are always evolving and constructing meaning. I think that's a great place for us to close out this conversation, Nandini. I really, really appreciate your time. This has been an absolute delight.
Thank you, Daniel.
And we're going to leave it right there. Thanks for sticking around. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on iTunes or Google Play. Thanks for your fine attention, and I'll see you next time. This is great. I love the ice is fully shattered. Cool.
I don't even know what that means, but that's awesome.
Well, because you can break the ice, or you can just shatter it into a million pieces.
Yeah, you're right. It's powdered. Yeah.
Yeah, just powdered ice.
Yeah.
Okay.